Early art in ante-Nicene time, between 100 and 330, is also worthwhile to considerate. Christian art emerged relatively late, and the first known Christian images emerged from about 200 AD, though there is some literary evidence that small domestic images were used earlier. The oldest known Christian paintings are from the Roman catacombs, dated to about 200, and the oldest Christian sculptures are from sarcophagi, dating to the beginning of the 3rd century AD. Please watch the link, which gives more information on YouTube regarding early Christian art. Although many Hellenistic Greek-speaking Jews seem to have had images of religious figures, as at the Jura Europos house church, the traditional Mosaic prohibition of graven images no doubt retained some effect, although never proclaimed by theologians. This early rejection of images and the necessity to hide Christian practice from persecution leaves few archaeological records regarding early Christianity and its evolution. Okay, let's study this a little bit more in depth. Early Christian art and architecture, or Paleo-Christian art, is the art produced by Christians or under Christian patronage from the earliest period of Christianity to, depending on the definition used, sometimes between 260 and 525. In practice, identifiably Christian art only survives from the 2nd century onwards. After 550, at the latest, Christian art is classified as Byzantine or of some other regional type. It is hard to know when distinctly Christian art began. Prior to 100, Christians may have been constrained by their position as a persecuted group from producing durable works of art. Since Christianity was largely a religion not well represented in the public sphere, the lack of surviving art may reflect a lack of funds for patronage and simply small numbers of followers. But, and that's a consideration we follow, the Old Testament restrictions against the production of graven, an idol or fetish carved in wood or stone images, see also idolatry in Christianity, may also have constrained Christians from producing art. Christians may have been or purchased art with pagan iconography, but given it Christian meanings, as they later did. If this happened, Christian, so-called Christian art would not be immediately recognizable as such. Early Christianity used the same artistic media as the surrounding pagan culture. These media included fresco, mosaic, sculpture, and manuscript illumination. Early Christian art used not only Roman forms, but also Roman styles, so it got intertwined after the 2nd century, that's for sure. Late classical style included a proportional portrayal of the human body and impressionistic presentation of space. Late classical style is seen in early Christian frescoes, such as those in the catacombs of Rome, which include most examples of the earliest Christian art. Early Christian art and architecture adapted Roman artistic motifs and gave new meanings to what had been pagan symbols. For me personally, at that point, syncretism started, the mixture of heathen culture and Christianized forms of the same. Among the motifs adopted were the peacock, Vitis viniferivinis, and the Good Shepherd. Early Christians also developed their own iconography. For example, such symbols as the fish, ichthus, were not borrowed from pagan iconography. Early Christian art is generally divided into two periods by scholars. Before and after either the Edict of Milan of 313, bringing the so-called triumph of the Church under Constantine, or the First Council of Nicaea in 325. The earlier period, being called the pre-Constantinian or anti-Nicene period, as we call it, and after being the period of the first 7 ecumenical councils. The end of the period of early Christian art, which is typically defined by art historians as being in the 5th, 7th centuries, is thus a good deal later than the end of the period of early Christianity as typically defined by theologians and church historians, which is more often considered to end under Constantine around 313, 325. That's what we follow too by mentioning 330. In the Jura Europos Church of about 230 to 56, which is in the best condition of the surviving very early churches, there are frescoes of biblical scenes, including a figure of Jesus as well as Christ as the Good Shepherd. This church was under attack by ISIS and could have been totally destroyed. The building was a normal house, apparently converted to use as a church. The earliest Christian paintings in the catacombs of Rome are from a few decades before, and these represent the largest body of examples of Christian art from the pre-Constantinian period, with hundreds of examples decorating tombs or family tomb chambers. Many are simple symbols, but there are numerous figure paintings either showing orphans or female praying figures, usually represented the deceased person, or figures or shorthand scenes from the Bible or Christian history. The style of the catacomb paintings and the entirety of many decorative elements are effectively identical to those of the catacombs of other religious groups, whether conventional pagans following ancient Roman religion or Jews or followers of the Roman mystery religions. The quality of the painting is low compared to the larger houses of the rich, which provide the other main corpus of paintings surviving from the period, but a shorthand depiction of figures can have an expressive charm. A similar situation applies at Jura Europos, where the decoration of the church is comparable in style and quality to that of the larger and more lavishly painted Jura Europos synagogue and the Temple of Bel. At least in such smaller places, it seems that the available artists were used by all religious groups. It may also have been the case that the painted chambers in the catacombs were decorated in similar style to the best rooms of the homes of the better off families buried in them, with Christian scenes and symbols replacing those from mythology, literature, paganism, and eroticism, although we lack the evidence to confirm this. We do have the same scenes on small pieces in media such as pottery or glass, though less often from the pre-Constantinian period. Well, many people who try to figure out Christianity also want to emphasize that Christianity evaluated, so went through an evolution like other religions, which is true. But since we want to go back to the New Testament and go back to first love, we want to always seek desperately, vigorously after the original meant purposes of God Himself, and not um, um, just accept those mixtures as being the norm. There was a preference for what are sometimes called abbreviated representations, small groups of say 1 to 4 figures forming a single motive which could be easily recognized as representing a particular incident. These vignettes fitted the Roman style of room decoration, set in compartments in a scheme with a geometrical structure. Biblical scenes of figures rescued from mortal danger were very popular. These represented both the resurrection of Jesus through typology and the salvation of the soul of the deceased. Jonah and the whale, the sacrifice of Isaac, Noah praying in the ark, Moses striking the rock, Daniel in the lion's den, and the 3 youths in the fiery furnace were all favorites that could be easily depicted. Early Christian sarcophagi were a much more expensive option, made of marble and often heavily decorated with scenes in very high relief, worked with drills. Freestanding statues that are unmistakably Christian are very rare and never very large, as more common subjects such as the Good Shepherd were symbols appealing to several religious and philosophical groups, including Christians, and without context no affiliation can be given to them. Typically sculptures, where they appear, are of rather high quality. One exceptional group that seems clearly Christian is known as the Cleveland Statues of Jonah and the Whales, and consists of a group of small statues of about 270, including 2 busts of a young and fashionable dressed couple from an unknown find spot, possibly in modern Turkey. The other figure tells the story of Jonah in 4 pieces with a good shepherd. How they were displayed remains mysterious. The depiction of Jesus was well developed by the end of the pre-Constantinian period. He was typically shown in narrative scenes with a preference for New Testament miracles and few of scenes from his passion. A variety of different types of appearance were used, including the thin, long-faced figure with long, centrally parted hair that was later to become the norm. But in the earliest images, as many show a stocky and short-haired beardless figure in a short tunic who can only be identified by his context. In many images of miracles, Jesus carries a stick or wand, which he points at the subject of the miracle, rather like a modern stage magician. Saints are fairly often seen, with Peter and Paul, both martyred in Rome, according to tradition, by some way the most common in the catacombs here. Both already have their distinct appearances retained throughout the history of Christian art. Other saints may not be identifiable unless labeled with an inscription. In the same way, some images may represent either the Last Supper or a contemporary agape feast. Well, you see, Christians were mostly following the surrounding artistic norms. It's interesting to think about this. We will continue and look at how saints were developed and how Christian art supported that development. God bless you. Early art in the pre-Nicene period is our subject, as you know, and we will now focus on saints. Veneration towards those who were considered holy began in early Christianity. The martyrs first being given special honor, commemorating day of death or when they were martyred. Later, collect relics of deceased martyrs. The official church commemorated the saints in Rome, beginning as early as the 3rd century. Over time, the honor also began to be given to those Christians who lived lives of holiness and sanctity. That's how they called it. Various denominations venerate and determine saints in different ways, with some having a formal canonization or glorification process. It is also the first step to becoming a saint. Early Christian art often depicted saints, thus strengthening the later veneration of the same. Now I want you to go in depth, asking yourselves pertinent questions. Split up in groups of 2, 3, 4, and just really discuss what your relation with saints is and how far you would think a genuine Christian should go. Regarding Christian art, for example, is it okay to have Christian art in churches? Flowers, all kinds of paintings, even depicting denominational leaders, photos of denominational leaders, or older so-called saints. What would you think? What would you think of Christian sculptures in general, and especially when they depict Jesus, Mary, or so-called saints? What would you think is a relation between the Mosaic prohibition of graven images and our thought about the same subject? We have seen that the early Christians rejected images, especially graven images. What is your relation regarding veneration? So I don't say adoration, it's just paying tribute to so-called saints, so-called holy men. Holy men, you know, and women, you know, who have deceased or not deceased. What would you think? What is your relation regarding martyrs? Maybe you know martyrs for Christ. Would you visit their grave? Would you commemorate their day when they passed away? What would you think about relics of deceased martyrs which were collected and are collected still? And people give special tribute to those relics, even bones. Would you really be in favor of commemorating saints, so-called saints, holy men and women, in your church body? Would you honor particular Christians more than others? Maybe the biblical Christians or the post-biblical Christians or martyrs, as I said before? Would you agree with canonization or glorification processes in your church body? Okay, that's enough, I think, and please consider it for at least 5 minutes, maybe 8 minutes or so, and then one of you per group could share it with the others, and then you can draw conclusions together. God bless you. We will proceed to the next slide. We already meditated about persecution, and now we will go a little deeper into this subject. In Sri Lanka, it's not strange to be persecuted on all levels. In the ante-Nicene period, between 100 and 330 AD, there was no empire-wide persecution of Christians until the reign of Decius in the 3rd century. Some say that Nero also persecuted all Christians, but that's not sure. The last and most severe persecution organized by the imperial authority was the Diocletian persecution between 303 and 311 AD. The Edict of Serdica was issued in 311 by the Roman Emperor Galerius, officially ending the persecution in the East. But the passage in 313 AD of the Edict of Milan, in which the Roman emperors Constantine the Great and Licinius legalized the Christian religion, persecution of Christians by the Roman state ceased. Armenia became the first country to establish Christianity as its state religion when, in an event traditionally dated to 301 AD, Gregory the Illuminator convinced Tiridates III, the king of Armenia, to convert to Christianity. The two links here on YouTube also provide more information. Now, most people know that the Roman Empire persecuted Christians, but why were the early Christians persecuted? Some of the early church writers, such as Tertullian, tried to argue that it was only the bad emperors who persecuted the church. Good emperors left the church in peace. Unfortunately, this is not completely true. Some bad emperors, such as Nero and Domitian, did persecute Christians, but other bad emperors like Commodus were tolerant, and some good emperors such as Trajan and the virtuous philosopher Emperor Marcus Aurelius, AD 161-180, were persecutors. In any case, persecution came not so much from the emperors themselves as from the governors at the empire's provinces and from popular hatred of the Christians. Another important factor is that the Roman state assumed the right to control the religious life of its subjects. It classified religions into two simple categories. Licita was the first category, which is permitted, and illicita, not permitted. Once it had become clear to Roman magistrates that Christians were not a Jewish sect, Christianity ceased to enjoy the permitted status of Judaism. The empire had to decide whether this new religion should fall into the permitted or not permitted category. Rome was normally tolerant in religious matters, but it felt that a particular religion was a threat to public morality or political stability, then in that case the authorities would suppress it. For example, they stamped out the cult of Bacchus in 186 because it led its worshippers into extremes of sexual depravity and violence. The question then is why Rome decided that the Christians were a threat to the well-being of the empire. And the answer lies in the exclusive truth claims that Christians made for their faith. The other religions of the empire were syncretistic, that is, they did not make any claim to be the one and only truth. A person could mix the religions and follow more than one. Christianity and of course Judaism stood out against this pattern. The Christians and the Jews insisted that they alone had the true faith and the only way of salvation. The Roman world could tolerate such a view in the Jews because Jews were simply following the traditional religion of their nation and ancestors and did not go around trying to make everyone else into Jews. But the Christians had no excuses. Their religion was new, unheard of, and burning with a passion to convert all pagans. So, the Church's exclusive, intolerant missionary attitude to other religions marked Christians out and made them very unpopular. To their pagan neighbors, this evangelistic devotion to Christ as the only Savior seemed highly arrogant and dangerously antisocial. To make things worse, Christians refused to worship the emperor or the genius of the emperor. The authorities saw this as a serious political offense. Worshipping the emperor was a sign of loyalty to the empire. To refuse was to be a traitor. The chief test of whether someone accused of being a Christian was a real Christian was for the magistrates to order him to worship a statue of the emperor and say, "Caesar is Lord." That is, Caesar is a divine figure, a god. A faithful Christian would refuse, because for him or her, Jesus is Lord, not Caesar. One could not worship both Caesar and Christ. Another reason for the great unpopularity of Christians was that most people believed them to be guilty of all kinds of evil practices. Pagans accused Christians of cannibalism, incest, and black magic. Some of these accusations arose through a misunderstanding of genuine Christian practices. The accusation of cannibalism, for example, was probably based on the Lord's Supper, where Christians spoke of eating Christ's flesh and drink his blood. The accusation of incest arose partly from the fact that Christians called each other brother and sister and loved each other. People were highly suspicious of Christians anyway, because Christians met in secret through fear of persecution and through the fact that they primarily were in houses, if not underground. It was a vicious circle because the authorities were likely to persecute them. Christians met in secret, but the more they met in secret, the more likely the authorities were to persecute them. Until the year 250, there were no persecutions of universal empire-wide extent. Outbreaks of persecution were local, limited to particular cities or provinces, and often short-lived. Pagans increasingly blamed and victimized Christians for any local calamity or disaster. In the words of Tertullian, when the Tiber floods or the Nile fails to flood, up goes the cry, "Christians to the lion." The idea was that the gods were angry because Christians were drawing people away from worshipping them. So pagans blamed all local catastrophes on the church. It became a common saying, "No rain because of the Christians." Since Christians did not worship the gods, people even regarded them as atheists. "Away with the atheist" was a popular anti-Christian cry. The first official government pronouncement about how Christians were to be dealt with came from the Emperor Trajan, AD 98-117. Pliny, the governor of the province of Bithynia in Asia Minor, wrote to Traian in AD 112 asking how he should handle people accused of being Christians. Traian's reply was that Pliny should not actively hunt down Christians and must not accept anonymous accusations. If anyone accused of being a Christian could prove that he was not, by worshipping the pagan gods, the magistrates must acquit him. But anyone found guilty of being a Christian must be put to death. This became the normal policy for the next 200 years. The worst period of persecution in the 2nd century came under the Stoic Emperor Marcus Aurelius, from 161 till 180, who had great contempt for Christians. Believers were executed in Africa, Rome and France. The authorities killed a large number of Christians in Lyons and Vienna in the south of France, and a particularly violent persecution in AD 177. Marcus Aurelius was not personally responsible for these persecutions, but if he knew of them, we can be fairly sure he would have done nothing to stop them. The most virtuous of the pagan emperors was no help to the Church. An eyewitness account of the persecution in Lyons and Vienna has survived, and it gives us a vivid picture of the sort of treatment Christians could expect from the Roman authorities. Let us follow the account, as it tells us about what happened to a Christian slave girl called Blandina. Here is the story. The entire anger of the people, governor and soldiers was stirred up furiously against Sanctus, the deacon from Vienna, and Maturus, a new convert, but a noble fighter, and Attalus, a native of Pergamum, where he had always been a pillar and support, and Blandina, through whom Christ demonstrated that things which seem lowly and obscure and contemptible to man, and these things are of great glory with God through her love toward him revealed in power, not boasting in mere appearance. We all shuddered, and Blandina's earthly mistress, herself one of the martyrs, feared that on account of bodily weakness she would be unable to make bold confession. Blandina was filled with such power that she was delivered and exalted above those who were torturing her by turns, from morning till evening in every way, so that they confessed they were conquered and could not do anything more to her. They were amazed at her endurance, because her whole body was mangled and broken. They declared that just one of these forms of torture was enough to destroy life, let alone so many and so great sufferings. But the Blessed Woman, contending nobly, grew in strength by confessing her faith. She found comfort and rest and relief from the pain of her sufferings by exclaiming, "I am a Christian, and we do nothing vile." Blandina was hung on a stake and exposed to the wild beasts who were supposed to attack her. She appeared as though she were hanging on a cross. Because of her ardent prayers, she inspired the other combatants with great enthusiasm. They looked upon her in her ordeal, and they saw with their outward eyes in the shape of their sister, the one who was crucified for them, that he might convince those who believe in him that everyone who suffers for Christ's glory has fellowship forever with the living God. Since none of the wild beasts at the time touched Blandina, she was taken down from the stake and thrown again in prison, preserved for another contest. On the last day of this contest, Blandina was again brought in, together with Ponticus, a boy who was about 15 years old. Every day they had been brought in to see the sufferings of the others, and had been pressured to swear by the pagan idols. But they stood steadfast and despised the idols, so that the mob became furious. They had no compassion for the boy's youth, nor any respect for the tender sex of the woman. So they subjected them all to terrible sufferings and took them through the whole course of torture, repeatedly pressing them to swear by the idols, but to no avail. Ponticus was encouraged by his sister, so that even the pagans could see she was confirming his strength. After nobly enduring every torture, he gave up his spirit. But the Blessed Bandina, last of all, having encouraged her children like a noble mother, and sent them ahead in victory to the king, herself suffered all their conflicts and hurried after them, exulting and rejoicing in her departure, as if she were called to a marriage supper, rather than being thrown to wild beasts. After whipping her, giving her to the beasts and burning her with hot irons, the authorities finally dropped her into a basket and threw her to a bull. The beast gored her again and again, but she was now indifferent to all that befell her, because of her hope, her firm hold on all that her faith meant, and her communion with Christ. Then she too was sacrificed. The pagans themselves admitted that they had never known a woman suffer so much or so long. The early church felt the highest reverence for its martyrs. It saw them as Christians who had most fully followed their Lord by being confirmed to his death. The church therefore treated the dead body of a martyr, of what was left of it, with special respect and tenderness. For example, after the martyrdom of Bishop Polycarp of Smyrna in AD 160, the Christians of Smyrna took care to preserve his physical remains. We gathered his bones, which are more valuable than precious stones and finer than the purest gold, and we laid them in a suitable place where the Lord will permit us to meet together in gladness and joy to celebrate the birthday of his martyrdom. So you see here, it started to be kind of veneration of so-called holier men and women. This quotation shows us that the Smyrnian unbelievers would hold a special religious service every year on the day of that Polycarp was put to death, to treasure in their hearts the memory of their great bishop and martyr. Christians all over the Roman Empire did the same for their own local martyrs. Over the next few centuries, Christians pieced together the information about the different martyrs so that the whole church came to consecrate many days in the year to the celebration of one or more of these heroes of the faith. This meant that, for instance, all Christians, not just of Smyrna, would be remembering Polycarp on the day of his death. Later, other great Christians, called saints, who had not died a martyr's death, also had special days assigned to them for the church to consider their lives and deeds on that day. This practice has continued to the present day within Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. Protestants, however, abandoned it at the Reformation, partly because so many legends about the martyrs and saints had crept into the stories of their lives. A legend is a grand but historically untrue tale. The early church's reverence for the bones of its martyrs laid the basis for the cult of relics. Well, that's it for now. We of course will see how the persecution stopped in a later stadium, especially when the Christianity became the established religion of the Roman Empire. Let's proceed now to later antiquity, a new period in the life of the Church throughout the ages. So we have come now in a new period of time called late antiquity. And we will especially focus today on Emperor Constantine the Great. How much Christianity Constantine adopted at this point is difficult to discern, but his ascension was a turning point for the Christian Church. He supported the Church financially, built various basilicas, granted privileges like exemption from certain taxes to clergy, promoted Christians to some high offices, and returned confiscated property. Constantine played an active role in the leadership of the Church. In 316 AD, he acted as a judge in a North African dispute concerning the Donatist controversy. So you see that the star of the emperor rose, even sometimes kind of above the Church. More significantly, in 325 he summoned the Council of Nicaea, the first ecumenical council. He thus established a precedent for the emperor as responsible to God for the spiritual health of his subjects, and thus with a duty to maintain orthodoxy. He was to enforce doctrine, root out heresy, and uphold ecclesiastical unity. He reigned from 306 till 337 AD. Here is a link and you will find more information when you watch the video. Well, let's go in depth here. When Emperor Diocletian stepped down in 305, it was mainly also because he was ill and he had intended himself and his fellow Augustus Maximian to rule only for a 20-year period. So he forced Maximian to resign at the same time. This meant that Galerius, the man responsible for the anti-Christian policy, became the new Augustus in the eastern half of the empire, with the result that persecution in the east became even more violent. However, the tolerant Constantius became Augustus in the west. When Constantius died in 306, his troops made his son Constantine, born about 280 and died in 337, into the new Caesar in the northern British city of York. The west was now divided between Constantine, who controlled Britain, France and Spain, and Maxentius, who controlled Italy and northwest Africa. Constantine was tolerant, but Maxentius was anti-Christian. In 311, Galerius finally gave up persecuting the church in the east. He admitted he had failed to destroy Christianity and issued a new edict of religious toleration. He was a sick man at the time and asked the Christians even to pray for him. He died soon afterwards. The east was now divided between Licinius, who controlled Greece and the Balkans, and Maximinus Daia, who controlled Asia Minor, Syria, Palestine and Egypt. Licinius was tolerant, but Maximinus Daia started persecuting the church again. The uneasy peace in the west between the tolerant Constantine and the anti-Christian Maxentius came to an end in 312. War broke out. Constantine, with a smaller army than Maxentius, invaded Italy. The two armies faced each other across the Milvian Bridge on the river Tiber outside Rome. Up to this point, Constantine had been a sun worshipper. However, on the night before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, he had a dream in which the first two Greek letters of the name Christ, Chi and Rho, in Greek it's like an X and a P, appeared, one on top of the other in the shape of a cross, producing the symbol depicted, which is well known all over the world, this hero signal. Constantine also saw or heard the words, "By this sign you will conquer." In the following day, Constantine had the hero sign painted on the shields of his troops. The Church has often used the hero sign since then as a Christian symbol. When I was young, I joined the Hero, which was a youth movement, a Catholic youth movement. I was Roman Catholic in those days. So it's true. Then Constantine prayed to the God of the Christians for victory and won an amazing and crushing triumph over Maxentius, who was killed in battle. At the age of 32, Constantine was master of the West. He believed that the Christian God had granted him victory, and from now on Constantine acted as the great champion and protector of Christians. What kind of person was this new young imperial friend of the Church? Constantine was a tall, strong, handsome man, whose physical presence always had a very positive and imposing impact on others. He had a sharp insight into people's characters and motives, an ability to strike swiftly and precisely in war and politics, and an overflowing energy which he devoted unselfishly to the affairs of the empire. The brightest features of his moral character were his generosity with money, his sense of justice as a ruler, and his purity in matters of sex. All his Christian biographers gloried in the third of these virtues, so rare in politicians at that time. However, Constantine was also vain and flashy about his personal appearance, an easy prey to flattery, and increasingly tyrannical as his power increased. He could become extremely suspicious about the loyalty of relatives, friends and servants, with tragic results in the case of his son Crispus. Constantine's acceptance of the Christian faith was the most important conversion in history, apart from that of the Apostle Paul, as we will see, and it altered the religious destiny of the Roman Empire. Because of his historic influence, Constantine certainly deserved the title that was given him, Constantine the Great. Yet Christians and historians have often debated what really happened that fateful night at the Milvian Bridge. Some have concluded that Constantine did not sincerely embrace Christianity at all. They point to some distinctly unchristian acts in Constantine's life later, like his ordering the killing of a number of people for purely political reasons, or in a fit of rage. The darkest of these periods was when Constantine had his own son Crispus put to death in 326. Constantine's wife, Fausta, falsely accused Crispus, her stepson, of trying to rape her. And Constantine, seething with fury, ordered Crispus's execution without giving him a chance to answer the charge. Were these the acts of a true follower of Jesus Christ, some have asked? But this is not a very fair argument unless we can prove either that Christian rulers are sinlessly perfect or that Constantine never repented, as some historians from the early church period say. He did repent of Crispus's judicial murder. Orthodox Christians who believe in the Trinity have also felt disturbed by the way that in the last years Constantine began favoring the Arian heresy, which denied that Christ was God in the flesh. But this does not disprove Constantine's Christian sincerity. It only calls in question this theological judgment in a controversy which was confusing in its earlier half, that many Orthodox bishops opposed those who upheld the deity of Christ. On the other side, we can point to strong evidence of a Christian conscience at work in many of Constantine's laws and policies. We must also recognize that Constantine had nothing to gain, either in a political or military sphere, by professing the Christian faith. The Roman ruling classes were almost entirely pagan, in their religious loyalties, and by far the most popular religion in the army was the Eastern mystery cult of Mithraism. So whatever Constantine's motives were, his conversion cannot have been the product of a desire to win political or military favor. After his victory at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, he certainly confirmed outwardly to Christianity. He regularly attended Christian worship, listened to the longest sermons without murmuring, and observed Easter with great solemnity. Indeed, Constantine often made speeches to his court in which he condemned pagan idolatry and sang the praises of Christianity as the one true faith. And when his courtiers clapped and cheered him, he would always redirect their applause by pointing upwards to heaven. No doubt the arguments over Constantine's conversion will continue to rumble on, but the simple fact is that at the distance of 1,700 years, it is impossible for us to be sure what was really going on in Constantine's heart and mind when he professed the Christian faith. All we can do is look at the effects which this crucial event had on the history of the Church. While Constantine was triumphing over Maxentius in the west, war broke out in the east between Licinius and Maximinus, and Licinius won. He now controlled the entire eastern half of the empire. In 313, Constantine and Licinius met in Milan, northern Italy, and agreed on a policy of freedom for all religions, pagan and Christian. For the first time, the empire gave Christianity full legal status as an officially tolerated faith. However, Licinius was still a pagan and grew increasingly anti-Christian over the next decade. He dismissed all Christians from the army and prohibited all meetings of bishops. In 320, he started persecuting Christians violently. His soldiers destroyed church buildings and put bishops and presbyters to death. Licinius' motive was probably suspicion. He had become convinced that his Christian subjects were secretly loyal to Constantine, their fellow believer. The tensions between Licinius and Constantine finally broke out into open war in 324. Constantine invaded the east. He regarded himself as fighting a holy war against Licinius to rescue the Eastern Church from persecution by an anti-Christian tyrant. Constantine defeated Licinius at the Battle of Chrysopolis in Bithynia, Asia Minor, took him prisoner and executed him. Constantine, the Christian, was the single undisputed master of the entire Roman Empire. So, enough about Constantine for now. We will proceed to the next slide. We now come to Emperor Julian the Apostate. Constantine's son's successor, his nephew Julian, under the influence of his advisor Mardonius, renounced Christianity and embraced a Neoplatonic and mystical form of paganism, shocking the Christian establishment. He began reopening pagan temples, modifying them to resemble Christian traditions, such as the episcopal structure and previously unknown public charity in Roman paganism. Julian's short reign ended when he died in battle with the Persians. He reigned from 361 till 363 AD. On this map you can see the spread of Christianity. In dark blue, in 325, you see where Christianity spread thus far in Asia, in Africa, in Europe, India, or even perhaps Sri Lanka is not mentioned here. It's interesting to go a little bit more in depth regarding Constantine, Julian, and the spread of Christianity. We go back to Constantine for a while. In addition to granting freedom and favors to the church and bending it to the service of the empire, Constantine in 330 founded the city of Constantinople, which is now in Turkey. This act helped to divide East and West and open the way for the schism of 1054, but it did provide a haven for Greco-Roman culture when the West fell to the German tribes in the 5th century. It became the center of political power in the East, and the Bishop of Rome was left after 476 with political as well as spiritual power. The sons of Constantine continued his policy of favoring the church and even went beyond it to such an extent that they forced paganism unto the defense by such procedures as edicts banning pagan sacrifices and attendance at pagan temples. Just when it looked as if Christianity would shortly become the state religion, it received a setback by the accession of Julian, which we have discussed here, in 361 to the imperial throne. Julian had been forced to accept Christianity outwardly, but the death of his relatives at the hands of the Christian ruler and his study of philosophy at Athens inclined him to become a follower of Neoplatonism. He took away from the Christian church her privileges and restored full freedom of worship. Every facility was given to aid the spread of pagan philosophy and religion. Fortunately for the church, his reign was short, and the setback to the development of the church was only temporary. Later rulers continued the process of granting privileges to the church until Christianity finally became the state religion. Emperor Gratian renounced the title of Pontifex Maximus, and Theodosius I in 380 and 381 issued edicts that made Christianity the exclusive religion of the state. Any who would dare to hold to any other form of worship would suffer punishment from the state. The Edict of Constantinople in 392 prohibited paganism. Justinian in 529 struck paganism a further blow by ordering the closing of the school of philosophy at Athens. Looking back at the steps by which Christianity, a despised sect with small numbers, became the official religion of the mighty Roman Empire, one might well believe, with the advantage of the perspective of time, that the victorious march was detrimental to the church. It is true that Christianity had raised the moral tone of society so that, for example, the dignity of women was given more recognition in society. Gladiatorial shows were eliminated. Slaves were given milder treatment. Roman legislation became more just and the spread of missionary work was speeded up. But the church also found that while there were advantages to close association with the state, there were also marked disadvantages. The government, in return for position, protection and aid, demanded the right to interfere in spiritual and theological matters. We will see that later, like in Arles in 314 and Nicaea 325. The state himself arrogated the right to arbitrate the dispute in the church, even though the emperor was only the temporal ruler of the empire. The long, vexatious problem of the struggle between the church and the state had its beginning in this era. Unfortunately, the church, when it gained power, too often became as arrogant a persecutor of paganism as the pagan religious authorities had ever been of the Christians. It would appear, on balance, that the rapprochement between church and state brought more drawbacks than blessings to the Christian church. Well, that's exactly the discussion I want you to have. For, let's say, 5 to 7 minutes, please split up in small groups. One of you takes a note, please, and then go back to the forum and give your conclusions. Would you say, indeed, like Cairns does in his Christianity Through the Centuries, that the recognition and the status of the church brought more drawbacks than blessings to the Christian church? Would you agree? After you have discussed it, please pray it through, again in small groups, and ask the Lord that our church bodies, as we know it, will always remain true to the gospel and humble, and recognize that the one ruler is God Himself. Thank you very much, and God bless you. We will proceed to the next slide.